My name is Carol. I am 35 years old. Last November, I sat at my parents' dining table in Machias, Maine, listening to the wind rattle the window panes off the Atlantic. My younger brother Kevin sat across from me holding court about his eldest son's travel hockey tournament. When I quietly asked him to pass the butter, Kevin stopped talking. He looked at my worn flannel shirt. He offered a tight, condescending smirk. "You would not understand busy family schedules, Carol," he said. "Where are your husband and kids? Oh, right, you do not have any." My father chuckled, a low rattle in his chest. My mother raised a cloth napkin to her mouth to hide her grin. A heavy, suffocating quiet settled over the room. I did not scream. I did not cry. I set my fork down next to my plate of baked haddock. I looked straight into my brother's smug expression. "Where is your money, Kevin?" I asked. "Oh, right, I have been supporting you until today." The laughter died in an instant. The tension in the room thickened into concrete. I stood up, grabbed my wool coat from the back of the chair, and walked out into the freezing coastal night without another word. That was the evening my entire family fractured. Before I bring you back into that dining room, take a second to like this video, subscribe to Silent Vengeance Stories, and drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. To understand the cruelty of their laughter, you have to understand what my daily life looks like. I have worked as a waitress at a Route 1 diner since I was 19 years old. My life consists of early morning shifts pouring black coffee for fishermen, aching arches, and solitary routines. I live in a cramped apartment above a hardware store on Main Street. I keep my thermostat set to 60 degrees in the dead of winter to save cash. I live this frugal, quiet life because for the past 4 years, I have been quietly paying my parents' property taxes and their winter heating oil bills. Thomas and Martha claimed their retirement savings were drained by medical debts. They painted a picture of two vulnerable seniors struggling to survive the harsh New England winters. I believed them. I handed over envelopes of my hard-earned cash to keep a roof over their heads. I sacrificed my own comfort skipping vacations and ignoring my own savings account to ensure they stayed warm. But sitting in the cold front seat of my rusted sedan that Sunday night, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, the math finally clicked into place. Kevin is a lobsterman. In our part of the state, that profession carries a specific rugged prestige. Yet while I was handing our parents $2,000 to cover emergency roof repairs, Kevin had somehow managed to purchase a brand new heavy-duty Ford diesel truck. He flaunted it in the driveway that very evening, bragging about the heated leather seats. The betrayal formed a cold, heavy knot in my stomach. My parents were not drowning in medical debt. They were systematically funneling my waitress tips to subsidize my brother's failing commercial fishing business. They drained my meager livelihood to protect their golden son, the man who gave them grandchildren, while I poured coffee for strangers. And then they sat at a dinner table and laughed at my empty house. They thought I would stay quiet. They thought wrong. I drove away from my parents' coastal property with the heater in my sedan blasting at full capacity. The rusted vents blew lukewarm air against my frozen knuckles. The coastal highway winding through Machias offered no comfort, just a dark stretch of asphalt bordered by towering pines and the relentless churning of the Atlantic Ocean. I parked behind the hardware store on Main Street, killed the engine, and sat in the dark for a long time. My feet throbbed. Decades of balancing heavy ceramic plates and dodging swinging kitchen doors leave a permanent ache in your arches. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs to my apartment, unlocking the deadbolt with numb fingers. The space inside felt like an icebox. I walked past the thermostat, leaving the dial firmly at 60 degrees, and wrapped a thick wool blanket over my shoulders. My parents lived in a sprawling, drafty farmhouse perched on a rocky bluff. It was the kind of property that looked picturesque on a postcard but cost a fortune to maintain. The wind tore off the ocean, stripping the paint and seeping through the single-pane windows. 4 years ago, my father Thomas sat me down in their living room. He held a stack of past-due medical invoices in his lap. He claimed his heart condition and the resulting surgeries had devoured their entire retirement portfolio. He stared at the floor, rubbing his temples, playing the role of a proud Maine patriarch brought low by a failing body. My mother Martha wept softly in the corner, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She told me the county was threatening to seize the property over unpaid property taxes. She painted a vivid, terrifying picture of two vulnerable seniors being thrown out into the snow. I believed every single syllable. I am the unmarried daughter, the one who stayed behind while my high school classmates moved to Boston or Portland. I assumed the burden of care. I began handing them thick envelopes of cash. I took on double shifts at the diner, working breakfast and dinner rushes, smelling perpetually of fryer oil, bleached countertops, and stale coffee. I hoarded my tips. I saved every crumpled $1 bill, every five, every quarter. I ignored the strange rattling noise in my car engine. I skipped my dental checkups. I bought my clothes off clearance racks and ate leftover clam chowder from the restaurant kitchen to keep my grocery bills low. I funneled all my spare income directly into their bank accounts. I paid the exorbitant winter heating oil delivery fees so they would not freeze. I covered the property taxes so they would not lose the ancestral home. Sitting at my small Formica kitchen table that Sunday night, the memory of their laughter ringing in my ears, I needed to see the truth in black and white. I pulled a cardboard shoebox down from the top shelf of my closet. It held 4 years of bank statements, ATM receipts, and tax records. I spread the papers across the table, the harsh overhead light casting long shadows over the numbers. I grabbed a yellow highlighter and a calculator. I started tracing the exact timeline of my withdrawals. I highlighted every time I drained my savings to rescue Thomas and Martha. Then I cross-referenced those dates with the major events in my brother's life. In our region of New England, lobstermen hold a mythical status. They are treated like local royalty, symbols of rugged independence and hard work. Kevin inherited my father's wooden boat and the family fishing license. But the Atlantic waters are changing, the yields are shrinking, and federal regulations make independent fishing an incredibly precarious living. Kevin was constantly complaining about the rising cost of diesel and the poor catches. Yet his lifestyle never reflected a struggling fisherman. Kevin strutted through town like a king, wearing designer sunglasses and expensive waterproof gear, while I taped the soles of my work shoes together to make them last another season. I stared at a specific bank statement from early October, 3 weeks prior to the dinner. Martha had called me in a frantic state. She claimed a brutal autumn storm had torn the shingles off their roof. She said the water was leaking directly into their bedroom, and they needed $2,000 immediately to pay a local contractor. I emptied my emergency fund. I drove to the local bank branch, withdrew the cash in crisp $100 bills, and handed the envelope directly to my father. Now I looked at the calendar. 4 days after I handed my parents that envelope, Kevin rolled up to the diner in a brand new heavy-duty Ford diesel truck. It had heated leather seats, a pristine chrome grille, and off-road tires that had never touched mud. He bragged to the waitstaff that he put down a substantial cash deposit to secure the financing. The terrible arithmetic clicked into place. The dates aligned perfectly. The emergency roof repair was a phantom crisis. There was no leak. There was no contractor. My parents were not drowning in medical debt. They were running a quiet domestic money laundering operation. They were extracting my hard-earned waitress tips, utilizing my empathy as leverage, and funneling that cash directly to my brother. They were subsidizing Kevin's failing commercial fishing business to keep up his facade of success. He needed to look like the prosperous captain, and my parents decided I was going to foot the bill. They drained my meager livelihood to protect the golden son, the man who provided them with the grandchildren they valued above all else. I sat alone in the freezing apartment, staring at the yellow highlighter marks on my bank statements. I ran my fingers over the edge of the printed paper, feeling it bend under my grip. The silence of the apartment felt different now. It was no longer a sanctuary of frugal independence. It felt like a trap I had willingly walked into. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It was a profound, suffocating betrayal. They had traded my security, my youth, and my comfort to finance a lie. I had spent half a decade pouring coffee and rubbing my aching joints to buy a truck for a man who mocked me for being alone. They laughed at my empty house, ignorant of the fact that they were the reason I could never afford to build a life of my own. My chest tightened as the depth of their manipulation settled into my bones. I needed to understand exactly what kind of financial ruin my brother was hiding beneath his expensive new truck. The cold knot in my stomach did not instantly turn to unyielding hatred. I am a pragmatic woman. I pour black coffee for fishermen every morning, navigating the narrow aisles between vinyl booths, listening to their hushed, frantic conversations. I hear the anxious murmurs about restrictive trap limits, the skyrocketing cost of diesel fuel, and the looming threat of offshore wind farms. I overhear the harbor gossip before it ever reaches the local newspaper. Because of this daily exposure to the grim reality of our local economy, I know my brother is not a two-dimensional villain who wakes up every morning plotting ways to inflict pain. Kevin is a drowning man thrashing wildly in the dark, terrified of losing his entire identity. In Washington County, Maine, hauling lobster traps is not just a job you do to pay the utility bills. It is a bloodline. It is a sacred generational legacy passed from calloused hand to callous hand. A man's worth in Machias is often measured by the length of his boat, the size of his daily catch, and the rugged stoicism he projects while enduring the freezing Atlantic spray. But the ocean is changing. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than almost any other body of water on the planet. The lobsters are migrating further offshore seeking colder depths. The yields drop lower every season, while the federal fishing regulations tighten like a noose. Independent operators are suffocating under layers of expensive gear mandates, restricted fishing zones, and mounting commercial debt. Kevin inherited my father's old wooden boat, a beautiful but horribly inefficient vessel named the Martha Jane, along with a mountain of unspoken expectations. Thomas expected his son to conquer the ocean the exact same way he did in the 1980s, back when the water was freezing, diesel was cheap, and the catches were endless. Kevin carried the crushing weight of that legacy every time he stepped off the wooden docks. He possessed a wife, Sarah, and 3 growing boys who played expensive travel hockey and wore premium brand-name winter gear. He built a domestic lifestyle based on a local economic boom that simply no longer existed. I know the grim reality of his desperation, because small towns leak secrets and bank tellers eat breakfast at my diner. 3 weeks before our explosive Sunday dinner, his polished facade finally cracked. Kevin sat alone in his leased bait shed on the edge of the harbor. The air inside that dilapidated wooden shack reeked of rotting herring, damp rope, and heavy petroleum. The relentless Maine wind howled through the gaps in the siding, biting at his exposed skin. He sat on an overturned plastic bucket, staring at a piece of heavy bond paper illuminated by a single swinging bare bulb. It was a formal foreclosure notice from the local credit union regarding his commercial boat slip. Without a slip, a captain cannot dock his boat. Without a boat, a captain cannot fish. Without fishing, Kevin ceases to be a lobsterman, stripping away the only identity he has ever known. Sitting in the foul-smelling dark, crushed by the shame of failing his family, my brother broke down. He dropped the bank notice onto the damp floorboards and wept into his cracked, freezing hands. The rugged, unbreakable New England captain cried alone in the damp shack, terrified of looking his wife in the eye and admitting he was entirely broke. That moment of vulnerability explains his actions, but it does not excuse them. Desperation twists a person's moral compass, warping their sense of entitlement. Kevin genuinely believed that because he continued the family trade, because he provided male heirs to carry on the family name, the family owed him a financial life raft. He viewed my parents' retirement savings as his birthright, an emergency fund reserved exclusively for the golden son. When those savings ran dry, he turned his gaze toward me. I was just the unmarried sister serving eggs to tourists on Route 1. I had no children to feed. I had no legacy to protect. In his mind, my money was disposable while his pride was essential. He saw my solitary life as a blank slate devoid of meaning because I lacked a husband and children. Society often expects the unmarried daughter to quietly absorb the burdens of the aging family, sacrificing her own future to prop up the siblings who chose traditional paths. Kevin and my parents leaned heavily into this unspoken rule. They assumed I would never notice the missing funds because they assumed my world was small enough to fit inside a diner and a tiny apartment. I was not stealing to buy luxury yachts or take extravagant tropical vacations. He was stealing to preserve a rugged masculine illusion that was slipping through his fingers like seawater. He needed a brand new diesel truck to project financial stability to the other captains at the harbor cooperative. He needed my hard-earned cash to plug the gaping holes in his sinking commercial operation. My parents, blinded by their adoration for their grandsons and their desperate need to maintain social standing in our tight-knit community, gladly facilitated the theft. They willingly became his accomplices, laundering my waitress tips under the guise of fake medical debts and fictitious roof leaks to spare Kevin the humiliation of bankruptcy. Understanding his motive did not extinguish my anger. It sharpened it into a precise, calculated edge. I packed the bank statements and tax records back into the cardboard shoebox and shoved it deep onto the top shelf of my closet. I finally reached out and turned the dial on my thermostat up to 70 degrees, letting the mechanical warmth flood my cramped apartment for the first time in years. I listened to the old radiator hiss and clank, promising myself I would never endure another shivering night to finance my brother's pride. The era of my quiet sacrifice was officially over. I worked my shifts at the diner for the next 3 days in silence, pouring coffee and wiping down vinyl booths, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. When you expose a deep family secret, the guilty parties do not apologize or seek redemption. They double down, They scramble to regain control of the narrative and secure the cash flow you just cut off. The first major obstacle arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, dragging our quiet domestic battle out of the shadows and directly into the harsh, uncompromising light of the legal system. My phone buzzed in my apron pocket near the end of the lunch rush. It was my father. He spoke with a strained, artificial politeness, demanding I come to the farmhouse immediately after my shift to discuss a pressing family legal matter. He acted as if the confrontation at the Sunday dinner had never occurred. I clocked out, traded my stained apron for my heavy wool coat, and drove back down the winding coastal highway. The ocean looked slate gray and violent under the heavy winter clouds, the waves crashing relentlessly against the rocky shoreline. The familiar route felt entirely different today, tainted by the knowledge of what lived inside that house. I parked my rusted sedan next to Kevin's pristine Ford diesel truck in the gravel driveway. I walked through the front door of the drafty house, bracing myself to defend my bank account and draw a firm line in the sand. Instead, I found a thick, imposing legal binder resting on the center of the coffee table, a document that possessed the power to permanently strip away my only remaining inheritance. The coastal wind hammered against the front of the farmhouse as I pushed the heavy oak door open. I stepped into the foyer and wiped my wet boots on the bristled mat. The air inside smelled of burning birchwood, old damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of brewing coffee. I walked into the living room, keeping my heavy coat buttoned tight against my chin. My father Thomas sat in his worn leather recliner near the cast-iron wood stove. My mother Martha perched on the edge of the floral sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Kevin stood near the stone fireplace, leaning his shoulder against the wooden mantel, staring into the flickering flames. Resting in the exact center of the polished oak coffee table was a thick black legal binder. They greeted me with an eerie, orchestrated normalcy. Martha offered me a cup of hot tea, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Thomas commented on the dropping barometric pressure and the severe winter storm blowing in off the dark Atlantic waters. It was a bizarre, choreographed performance designed to pretend the Sunday dinner blowout had never occurred. They operated under the assumption that if they ignored my rebellion, it would simply fade away like a passing storm. I declined this tea. I remained standing near the entryway, my hands thrust deep into my coat pockets, waiting for the polite charade to drop. Thomas eventually leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He cleared his throat and adopted his deep, authoritative patriarch tone. He pointed a weathered finger at the black binder resting on the table. He began to discuss the legal arrangement we finalized 3 years ago in a pristine office building in Bangor. In the state of Maine, residential nursing home care can cost upwards of $10,000 a month. The state possesses the legal authority to recover those exorbitant costs by seizing a patient's estate after they pass away. 3 years ago, terrified of losing this ancestral coastal property to government estate recovery, my parents hired a specialized elder law attorney. They executed an irrevocable Medicaid asset protection trust. They transferred the deed of the farmhouse into this trust, formally relinquishing their direct ownership to shield the property from future medical claims. Once the mandatory 5-year look-back period expired, the state could not touch the house. Because Kevin was already drowning in commercial fishing debt and possessed a messy financial history involving unpaid bait suppliers and maxed-out credit cards, the attorney strongly advised against making him the sole heir. Creditors could easily place a lien on his portion of the inheritance. Therefore, I was named as a primary remainder beneficiary. This meant that upon my parents' passing, the property would legally transfer to me. It was the unspoken reward for my quiet servitude. It was the singular asset that was supposed to secure my own fragile future after I spent my prime earning years paying their utility bills and ignoring my own retirement savings. Thomas tapped the rigid cover of the binder. He explained that family circumstances had shifted. He introduced a legal term I had never heard before, decanting. He spoke the word with rehearsed precision, making it sound like a routine surgical adjustment, rather than a drastic financial gamble. He explained they needed to decant the trust immediately. Decanting is a highly complex legal maneuver used to pour the assets of an existing irrevocable trust into a brand new trust featuring entirely different terms. It is essentially a loophole designed to alter a contract that is legally meant to be unalterable. Thomas wanted to dissolve the current protective structure, borrow against the equity of the farmhouse, and extract $80,000 in liquid cash. He did not attempt to hide the destination of the money. Kevin needed a bailout. The commercial boat loan on the family vessel was dragging him under the water. The new diesel truck parked in the gravel driveway had depleted whatever remaining cash reserves he possessed. The local credit union was threatening to seize his boat and revoke his slip at the harbor cooperative. The $80,000 would clear his immediate commercial arrears, satisfy his angry creditors, and secure his fishing license for another season. My parents were willing to risk their own home breaking the Medicaid shield and leaving themselves vulnerable to the state just to save his fragile pride. But there was a significant legal catch hidden within their desperate plan. Because the original trust was irrevocable, Maine state property law dictated that the grantors could not change the terms unilaterally. They needed the formal notarized consent of all listed beneficiaries. They needed my signature. Thomas opened the binder and extracted a dense stack of papers printed on heavy bond paper. He slid the documents across the oak coffee table. He placed a silver ballpoint pen directly on top of the signature line. He looked at me with a mild, expectant expression. Martha offered a tight, nervous pulling of her lips, a silent plea for compliance. Kevin stared at the braided rug, pretending he was not the reason we were all gathered in this room waiting for his sister to rescue him again. They expected the dutiful waitress to obey. They expected the 35-year-old spinster who wore taped work shoes and bought discount groceries to simply sign away her only financial safety net. They assumed my conditioning was so deep, my habit of rescuing them, so ingrained into my personality, that I would surrender my future inheritance without a single argument just to maintain the peace. They believed my loyalty to the family hierarchy would override my own basic instinct for survival. I looked down at the legal document. The stark black ink spelled out the total surrender of my rights. I realized the profound power resting in my frozen hands. The entire rescue operation hinged on my compliance. For the first time in my entire life, my signature was the only barrier standing between my brother and a substantial unearned payout. I held the keys to his commercial survival, and he knew it. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not sit down on the floral sofa to discuss the terms of my surrender. I looked at Thomas, then at Martha, and finally at Kevin. "I will not do it," I said. I spoke the words quietly, but they carried the weight of a heavy stone dropping onto a glass table. I stated that I would not sign the waiver. I would not authorize the extraction of equity to pay for a boat loan that should have been managed responsibly years ago. I would not let them bankrupt my future to fund his illusion. Thomas blinked, his face contorting in genuine confusion as if I had just spoken a foreign language. He asked me to repeat myself, his voice faltering, unable to process the refusal. I stepped forward, reached out with my index finger, and pushed the silver pen away. It rolled across the polished wood and clattered onto the floor. I told him I was done financing this charade. I told him my days of subsidizing Kevin were over. The polite illusion of family unity shattered into jagged pieces. The mild expressions vanished, replaced by an intense, terrifying hostility. Thomas gripped the padded armrests of his recliner, his knuckles turning stark white, his face reddened with sudden fury. He raised his voice, demanding respect, reminding me that this was his house and his equity. He shouted that I was an ungrateful child trying to ruin my own brother over a petty grudge. Martha leaped to her feet. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. Her voice grew shrill, echoing off the stone fireplace. She accused me of harboring deep resentment. She claimed I was a bitter woman trying to destroy her son out of pure jealousy because I had no family of my own. Kevin stepped away from the mantel. He closed the distance between us in 2 long strides, using his broad shoulders and significant height to intimidate me. The smell of diesel fuel and stale beer radiated off his heavy canvas jacket. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. He called me a selfish parasite. He told me I had no right to hold the family hostage over a piece of paper. I stood my ground. I looked up at my brother, feeling the icy draft leaking through the window panes brush against my neck. I reminded him that the credit union was holding him hostage, not me. I turned around, grasped the brass handle of the front door, and walked back out into the freezing coastal wind. The shouting followed me down the driveway, a chaotic chorus of blame and desperation setting the stage for a much darker kind of warfare. I drove away from the farmhouse with the sound of my father shouting fading into the roar of the ocean wind. The heater in my rusted sedan struggled to cut through the chill gripping my chest. I thought the worst part of the ordeal was over. I assumed drawing a firm boundary would result in a prolonged, icy silence. I underestimated the sheer desperation of people accustomed to spending someone else's money. The retaliation did not take weeks to materialize. It arrived the very next morning, and the strike was brutally targeted. Kevin knew he could not intimidate me physically. My brother understood that yelling in a gravel driveway would not produce a signature on a legal document. So he enlisted a different kind of warfare orchestrated entirely by his wife. Sarah was a woman who treated her local social status like a fragile glass sculpture. She spent her days managing travel hockey schedules, driving a spotless sport utility vehicle, and curating an image of upper-middle-class perfection on social media. She operated under the strict belief that the rest of the world existed solely to facilitate her comfort. When Kevin returned home that Thursday evening and confessed that the financial pipeline was permanently closed, Sarah recognized the imminent threat to her lifestyle. She did not reflect on their mounting debts or suggest downsizing their budget. Instead, she leveraged the only currency she possessed. She turned her children into weapons. My parents defined their entire existence through their 3 grandsons. For Thomas and Martha, those boys were tangible proof of a successful, thriving legacy. The grandparents attended every single regional hockey tournament, treating the freezing ice rinks as their personal social clubs. They bragged to the other coastal families about the boys' report cards and goal statistics, using the children as a shield against their own creeping irrelevance. Sarah understood this dynamic perfectly. She knew exactly where to slide the knife to inflict maximum panic. Before the diner opened for the breakfast rush on Friday, Sarah sent a long, vicious text message directly to my mother. She did not contact me. She bypassed the roadblock and went straight for the weakest link in the chain. The message laid out a ruthless ultimatum. Sarah declared that because I was tearing the family apart with my selfish refusal to sign the trust waiver, the environment was too toxic for her children, until the grandparents forced me to sign the decanting paperwork. Thomas and Martha were officially banned from seeing the boys. The text listed the upcoming events with surgical cruelty. There would be no Thanksgiving dinner at the farmhouse. There would be no attending the winter hockey invitationals in Portland. There would be no gathering around the tree on Christmas morning. Sarah effectively held the grandchildren hostage, demanding an $80,000 ransom paid in the form of my surrendered inheritance. The ultimatum sent my parents spiraling into a blind panic. They did not direct their anger at the woman utilizing her own sons as bargaining chips. They directed the entirety of their terror and rage at me. By mid-morning, my cell phone began vibrating endlessly in my apron pocket. I was carrying a tray of heavy ceramic mugs to a corner booth when the first voicemail registered. I stepped into the cramped employee break room, wiping spilled coffee off my hands with a rag, and pressed the device to my ear. Martha sounded unrecognizable. Her voice was not the polite, measured tone she used at church. It was a frantic, shrill torrent of blame. She wept into the receiver, gasping for air, recounting Sarah's text message word for word. Then the grief morphed into a venomous attack. My mother called me a bitter, ungrateful spinster. She accused me of trying to destroy their joy out of sheer jealousy. She claimed that because I had failed to secure a husband or build a family of my own, I was determined to sabotage Kevin's happiness. She demanded I drive straight to the elder law attorney in Bangor and sign the papers immediately. She ordered me to fix the mess I had created and restore their access to the grandkids. The messages kept coming. Every hour, another notification chimed. Thomas left a message, next his tone dark and authoritative, threatening to cut ties with me if I did not correct my disobedience. The digital barrage was relentless. They sought to grind my resolve down through sheer repetition, betting that I would eventually fold under the weight of their collective disapproval. The isolation felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. It was a suffocating pressure that made drawing a full breath difficult. I walked back out onto the diner floor, grabbing a fresh pot of dark roast and forced my face into a neutral, pleasant mask. I poured coffee for local contractors discussing lumber prices. I served stacks of blueberry pancakes to passing tourists. I smiled at strangers and asked about their travels, all while carrying the devastating knowledge that the people who shared my blood despised me. I was entirely cut off from the only family I had ever known, vilified and discarded simply because I refused to fund a predatory lie. Have you ever been punished by your own family for refusing to set yourself on fire just to keep them warm? It is a unique, agonizing type of loneliness. It seeps into your bones, colder than the coastal wind howling outside the restaurant windows. When the people you spent your entire adult life protecting suddenly turn you into the villain. The cognitive dissonance is blinding. You lie awake in a freezing apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the voicemails in the dark. You wonder if you are the monster they claim you are. You second-guess your own sanity. You ask yourself if holding onto a piece of paper is truly worth the total destruction of your family tree. You start to rationalize the surrender, thinking it might just be easier to sign the document and buy back the illusion of peace. But illusions are expensive, and I was out of currency. I thought about the rusted frame of my sedan. I thought about the 4 years of skipped dental appointments, the clearance rack coats, and the thermostat locked at 60 degrees. I thought about the yellow highlighter marks on my bank statements tracking the thousands of dollars I had poured into Kevin's brand new heated leather seats. They did not want a daughter or a sister. They wanted a blank checkbook. The guilt trip was designed to break me, but it only served to clarify the stakes. Surrendering my signature would not buy me love or respect. It would only validate their strategy. It would teach them that whenever Kevin overextended his credit, they could simply isolate me until I paid his debts. I realized that the grandchildren were not just Sarah's weapons. They were the chains binding my parents to their own ruin. I deleted the voicemails. I silenced my phone. I finished my shift, wiped down the stainless steel counters, and walked out into the freezing Maine night. The physical weight of the isolation remained heavy and ever-present, but my spine turned to steel. I refused to pick up the pen. My silence, however, was not enough to end the war. By Tuesday, the suppressed grief and the relentless pressure demanded a release. My refusal to bend forced the conflict out of the digital shadows and directly onto the wooden docks of the harbor, culminating in a messy public rupture I could no longer control. The pressure cooker of isolation does not forge a strategic mastermind overnight. Human endurance has a distinct physical limit. By Tuesday morning, the lack of sleep and the relentless barrage of voicemail notifications had stripped away my pragmatism. I did not handle the crushing weight of the family exile with cinematic grace. I did not formulate a brilliant counterattack while sipping coffee in the dark. Instead, the sheer unadulterated exhaustion boiled over into a chaotic, imperfect rupture. Maine coastal storms in late November do not offer picturesque snowfall. They deliver a punishing, freezing rain that cuts sideways off the Atlantic, turning the harbor into a bleak canvas of gray. I finished the breakfast rush at the diner, my arches burning and my uniform smelling of stale grease. I should have driven back to my apartment above the hardware store to rest. Instead, a dangerous, erratic energy hijacked my nervous system. I grabbed the bundle of crumpled municipal tax receipts from my glove compartment, gripped the steering wheel, and steered my rusted sedan toward the commercial docks. Growing up, Kevin never had to raise his voice. When you are the golden son, the designated heir to a generational fishing legacy, the world bends to your quiet preferences. If Kevin wanted something, Thomas and Martha provided it. He learned early on that maintaining a calm, stoic exterior forced everyone else to scramble to appease him. I, on the other hand, spent my entire life swallowing my grievances, trained to be the invisible, accommodating sister. The dam holding back 3 decades of forced compliance shattered the moment I saw him on the pier. The Machias commercial harbor reeked of damp rope, dead herring, and raw petroleum. I parked near the cooperative loading zone. Through the sleet sliding down my windshield, I spotted the Martha Jane. The old wooden boat bobbed against the pilings. Kevin stood on the slippery wooden deck loading heavy wire lobster traps. He wore his expensive insulated waterproof gear, looking every bit the rugged New England captain, oblivious to the financial devastation he was causing on shore. I stepped out into the freezing downpour. I did not possess a cool, calculated speech. I did not plan my words. I marched down the slick wooden pier, the crumpled tax receipts clutched tight in my fist. I wanted to force him to look at the numbers. I wanted him to see the physical proof of my stolen wages. Vengeance rarely cooperates with gravity. The wooden planks of the commercial docks are coated in a perpetual layer of ocean slime and wet algae. Halfway down the pier, my worn work shoe lost its traction. My feet flew out from under me in a sudden, jarring arc. I slammed hard onto the unforgiving wood. My knees absorbed the brunt of the impact, tearing the fabric of my jeans and scraping raw skin. My purse slipped from my shoulder, teetering perilously close to the edge of the dock before snagging on a rusted iron cleat. It was a pathetic, agonizing fall. The pain radiating up my shins was immediate and sharp. I scrambled back to my feet, my clothes soaked in freezing rainwater and foul-smelling harbor sludge. The adrenaline spiked, mixing toxic with the humiliating stumble. The dignified confrontation I envisioned vanished, leaving only jagged nerve endings exposed to the freezing air. I limped the remaining distance to his slip. The idling diesel engine of the Martha Jane hummed a low, vibrating rhythm. I stood on the edge of the dock, looking down at my brother. I opened my mouth to deliver a sharp reprimand, but the words fractured in my throat. My voice cracked into a high, unfamiliar pitch. I started screaming over the chugging exhaust of the boat. It was an ugly, stammering rant fueled by sheer grief. I sobbed furiously, the tears mixing with the freezing rain running down my cheeks. I uncurled my fist and hurled the bundle of crumpled tax receipts directly at his chest. The wind caught the loose papers, scattering them across the wet wooden deck and into the dark, churning water below. I shrieked that he was a parasite. The word tore from my lungs, raw and desperate. I pointed a trembling finger at him, my voice breaking as I accused him of bleeding our parents dry to pay for his fragile pride. I screamed that using his own children as hostages was the act of a coward, not a captain. I yelled until my throat felt like sandpaper, pouring every ounce of the isolation and betrayal into the freezing storm. I did not look triumphant. I did not resemble a strong, vindicated protagonist laying down the law. I looked utterly unhinged. I was a soaking wet, bruised, weeping waitress screaming at the ocean. The harbor is not a private arena. The commercial docks are always active. 3 slips down, a crew of weathered deckhands stopped sorting their bait buckets, turning to stare at the hysterical woman on the pier. A group of tourists in bright rain jackets standing near the adjacent seafood shack paused to point and whisper. The public spectacle was undeniable. Kevin did not yell back. He did not defend himself or attempt to justify his extortion. He simply stood on the deck of his boat, wiping a stray piece of wet paper from his expensive jacket. He looked up at me with an expression that cut deeper than any insult he could have spoken. He looked at me with profound, condescending pity. He slowly shook his head, pressing his lips together in a tight line of disapproval. He looked at the deckhands watching us, then looked back at me, pantomiming a subtle gesture of embarrassment on my behalf. He treated me exactly like a frantic, hysterical lunatic who had forgotten to take her medication. He did not see a sister demanding justice. He chose to see a broken, unstable spinster throwing a public temper tantrum over a few dollars. The lack of a fight was devastating. His calm, dismissive demeanor amplified my own chaos. The realization of how I appeared to the onlookers hit me like a physical blow. The righteous anger drained out of my system in a rapid, dizzying rush, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating blanket of shame. I stood there shivering in the rain, my bruised knees throbbing, aware that I had just surrendered my dignity for nothing. The scattered tax receipts dissolved in the harbor water, carrying my evidence out with the tide. I turned my back on the boat and retreated. I walked as fast as my injured legs would carry me, keeping my head bowed to avoid the stares of the fishermen. I reached my rusted sedan, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the heavy door shut against the storm. I gripped the freezing plastic steering wheel with trembling fingers. My chest heaved with ragged breaths. I stared out the rain-streaked windshield at the gray harbor, feeling the sting of the torn skin on my knees and the bitter taste of defeat in my mouth. I had played directly into his hands. By losing my composure in a public space, I handed him the exact narrative he needed. He now had an audience to corroborate his story. The golden son was just trying to work, and the unstable sister had attacked him. I put the car in gear and drove away from the docks, unaware that my messy public outburst was not just a humiliating defeat. It was the crucial piece of evidence my brother would use to launch a devastating legal strike against my freedom. I thought I had hit rock bottom on the wet wooden pier, but the real trap had not even snapped shut. The physical bruises from my fall on the commercial docks faded over the next 14 days. The scraped skin on my knees scabbed over and turned a dull, fading purple. The psychological sting, however, lingered in the cramped corners of my apartment. I spent 2 weeks waiting for the next strike from the farmhouse. The silence was heavy and deceptive. My phone did not ring. My mother stopped leaving frantic voicemails. The sudden absence of their pressure felt unnatural, like the sudden drop in barometric pressure right before a major nor'easter hits the coast. I foolishly attributed the quiet to a temporary retreat. I assumed my very public, humiliating breakdown had convinced them I was a lost cause, prompting them to look elsewhere for Kevin's bailout money. I failed to realize that Kevin was not retreating. He was drafting a blueprint for my destruction. My dockside meltdown provided my brother with the exact ammunition he needed to launch a devastating counterattack. He took my raw, imperfect grief and sculpted it into a weapon of legal precision. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The coastal sky outside my window hung low and gray, promising another round of freezing sleet. I stood in the narrow kitchen of my apartment above the hardware store, pressing a hot iron over my uniform apron. The smell of spray starch and burnt cotton filled the small room. Down below, I could hear the heavy metal security gate of the hardware store rolling shut for the day. My dinner shift at the Route 1 diner started in an hour. I unplugged the iron and draped the crisp apron over the back of a wooden chair. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the exterior wooden staircase leading to my door. They were not the quick, frantic steps of a lost tourist or the familiar shuffle of the mail carrier. These footsteps carried the steady, rhythmic weight of official business. A sharp, authoritative knock rattled the wooden frame of my door. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, walked across the faded linoleum floor, and turned the deadbolt. A woman stood on my narrow landing. She looked to be in her late 40s, wearing practical rubber-soled boots and a navy blue windbreaker shielding her from the biting coastal draft. A state-issued identification badge hung from a thick woven lanyard around her neck, resting against a clipboard clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Her expression possessed the flat, neutral detachment of a professional who deals exclusively in bad news. She asked if she was speaking to Carol. I nodded, feeling a sudden, inexplicable drop in my stomach. She introduced herself as an investigator from the Maine Department of Health and Human Services. Specifically, she worked for the Adult Protective Services Division in Augusta, assigned to the Washington County jurisdiction. She stated her name and her title with a brisk efficiency that left no room for casual pleasantries. She unclipped a folded document from her board and held it out toward me. The words on the heavy cardstock blurred for a second before snapping into terrifying focus. It was a formal notice of a preliminary inquiry. The investigator explained the nature of her visit without raising her voice. She maintained a sterile, bureaucratic tone as she outlined the allegations filed against me. A formal report had been lodged by a concerned family member regarding the welfare of Thomas and Martha. The complainant alleged severe financial elder abuse, psychological manipulation, and willful neglect. I stood frozen in this doorway, the freezing wind whipping my hair across my face, listening to the investigator recite a narrative that inverted reality with breathtaking cruelty. Kevin had gone to the state. He had bypassed family arguments and weaponized the government. According to the formal complaint, I was a mentally unstable daughter actively holding my parents' retirement trust fund hostage out of petty spite. Kevin claimed that by refusing to sign the trust decanting waiver, I was intentionally depriving two vulnerable seniors of the critical home equity they needed to pay for vital medical care and urgent structural repairs. He twisted the $80,000 boat bailout into a fictitious medical emergency for our father. He pointed to the crumbling roof of the farmhouse, the very roof I had already handed them $2,000 in cash to fix as proof of my deliberate neglect. But the most devastating part of his report relied on the events at the harbor. Kevin utilized my messy public outburst on the wooden pier as verified proof of my declining mental stability. He listed the deckhands and the passing tourists as potential witnesses to my erratic, hostile behavior. He framed the sobbing waitress hurling crumpled receipts as a dangerous predator aggressively harassing a devoted son who was just trying to protect his aging parents. The investigator handed me a tri-fold government pamphlet explaining my rights and the impending investigative process. She informed me that a caseworker would be assigned to audit my financial interactions with my parents for the past 5 years. She stated that I was strictly prohibited from attempting to coerce Thomas or Martha into altering their statements. She delivered the information with the practiced routine of someone executing a legal mandate, entirely blind to the agonizing irony of the situation. This was no longer a family squabble over unpaid utility bills and a diesel truck. This was a systemic legal threat. In a sprawling city, an inquiry might remain hidden in a maze of paperwork. But in a small insular coastal town like Machias, an elder abuse investigation is absolute public poison. Gossip travels faster than the tides in this region. If the rumor mill caught wind that the state was auditing my life for elder exploitation, my fragile existence would collapse. My survival depended entirely on my job at the diner. The owner, a pragmatic, no-nonsense local man who valued his community standing above all else, ran a tight ship. He relied on the patronage of the local fishermen, the municipal workers, and the church crowds. If state investigators started poking around the pie cases, asking questions about my character, and pulling me into the kitchen for interrogations, he would not hesitate to protect his business. He would fire me instantly to preserve the pristine reputation of his establishment. I would lose my income, my ability to pay the rent above the hardware store, and my last remaining shred of dignity in the town I had called home my entire life. I looked at the woman in the windbreaker. I wanted to scream the truth at her. I wanted to grab my shoebox of bank statements and force her to look at the heating oil receipts and the municipal tax ledgers. I wanted to explain the brand new truck parked in my parents' driveway. But the hard lesson I learned on the docks stopped the words in my throat. Raw emotion is a severe liability in a legal fight. If I lost my temper now, if I raised my voice or wept in the doorway, I would only validate Kevin's claim that I was unstable. The state does not operate on empathy, it operates on evidence. I forced myself to maintain a calm, steady posture. I thanked the investigator for the information, accepting the notice and the pamphlet with a steady hand. She offered a curt nod, turned around, and descended the wooden stairs, her boots echoing against the metal railings. I closed the door and slid the deadbolt into place. The apartment felt smaller than it ever had, the walls pressing inward. I leaned my back against the heavy wood, holding the government notice in my trembling hands. The trap had snapped shut with terrifying efficiency. I was boxed in by the rigid machinery of the state bureaucracy. Kevin had weaponized a system specifically designed to protect vulnerable seniors, twisting its noble purpose to forge a bulletproof shield for his own extortion. By initiating a formal inquiry, he forced me into a defensive posture, forcing me to prove my innocence before I could ever expose his guilt. I realized then that my righteous anger had walked me straight into a massive snare. Shouting on a pier was a fool's game. If I was going to survive this audit and save my livelihood, I could not fight a paper war with tears and accusations. I needed an interpreter who spoke the cold, unforgiving language of the probate courts. I looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. My shift was starting soon, but pouring coffee was no longer my primary concern. I needed to find a lawyer, and I needed to prepare for the agonizing reality that the justice system moves at a glacial, merciless pace. The morning after the investigator stood on my narrow landing, I requested a rare day off from the diner. I pulled my rusted sedan onto the highway and drove 90 miles inland toward Bangor. The coastal landscape of jagged rocks and gray ocean faded, replaced by dense, towering pine forests. Retaining an attorney meant unlocking the meager emergency fund I had spent 4 years building through double shifts and skipped meals. I parked outside a modest brick building near the Penobscot River. The cramped law office smelled of old paper floor wax and stale coffee. The probate attorney sat behind a heavy oak desk cluttered with manila case files. He possessed the tired, pragmatic demeanor of a man who spent his career untangling the messy financial disputes of grieving families. I sat in a rigid leather chair across from him, handing over the preliminary inquiry notice. Next, I pushed the heavy black binder containing the irrevocable trust documents across the desk. Finally, I placed my cardboard shoebox filled with highlighted bank statements and municipal tax receipts in front of him. I waited for him to offer a swift, decisive resolution. I harbored a naive expectation shaped by television procedurals. I wanted him to pick up his desk phone, call the state investigator in Augusta, read the dates on my highlighted bank statements, and force an immediate dismissal of the charges. I wanted the nightmare to end before my next dinner shift. The attorney adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, read through the formal notice, and set the paper down on his blotter. He looked at me with a sobering, heavy expression and systematically dismantled my assumptions. He explained that Adult Protective Services in Maine operates under a rigid, slow-moving bureaucratic mandate. They do not drop formal inquiries based on a single phone call or a box of receipts provided by the accused party. The government machinery requires exhaustive procedure. By filing the report, my brother had triggered an automatic evaluation protocol that could take up to 90 days to reach a formal conclusion. 90 days. The timeline struck me like a physical blow. For the next 3 months, my entire existence would be placed under a microscope. The attorney detailed the upcoming ordeal. The state would initiate rigorous financial audits, combing through every withdrawal deposit and transfer attached to my name for the past 5 years. They would likely freeze specific assets to prevent any alleged capital flight during the inquiry. They would demand formal recorded interviews with every single member of the family, dissecting decades of domestic history to build a psychological profile. I could not simply present the truth and walk away. I had to endure the excruciating process of being treated like a criminal suspect while the state slowly verified my innocence. Then the attorney delivered a stern, non-negotiable directive. He leaned across the desk, lowering his voice to emphasize the gravity of his instruction. I was strictly forbidden from contacting Kevin. I could not call him. I could not text him. And I certainly could not approach him at the commercial harbor. My brother had already established a documented narrative of my supposed instability on the wooden docks. If I confronted him again, even to demand an explanation or yell out of frustration, Kevin could easily file for a temporary restraining order. A restraining order would solidify his victim status in the eyes of the investigator and severely damage my credibility. The attorney warned me that Kevin would likely try to bait me. People who weaponize the legal system rely on their targets losing emotional control. I had to become a ghost to my own bloodline. If my parents reached out, I was to direct them to his law office. Every communication had to filter through official legal channels, stripping away the familial bond and replacing it with sterile documented correspondence. I nodded, absorbing the harsh parameters of my new reality. I wrote a check for his retainer fee, watching my bank balance plummet to a terrifying low, and left the brick building feeling poorer and more vulnerable than ever. The drive back to Machias felt infinitely longer than the morning commute. The winter sun dipped below the tree line, casting long, chilling shadows across the two-lane highway. I was trapped in a bureaucratic waiting room, powerless to speed up the clock. The justice system is not a swift sword. It is a slow grinding mill. I had to endure the friction. The next morning, I tied my apron strings and walked out onto the diner floor. The stark contrast between my internal terror and my external duties bordered on surreal. I spent my days moving through a familiar routine that suddenly felt like a high-stakes performance. The brass bell above the door chimed, signaling the arrival of hungry locals and passing travelers. I smiled, greeted regulars by their first names, and balanced heavy trays of hot fish chowder, fried haddock, and blueberry pie. I poured countless cups of dark roast coffee while carrying the devastating weight of the inquiry. Every time the front door opened, a spike of adrenaline hit my chest, fearing it was the state investigator returning for an unannounced interrogation. I watched the local patrons chat about the upcoming winter festival and the dropping lobster prices, wondering if any of them had heard the rumors. In a small town, reputation is a fragile currency. I knew that if the diner owner caught a whisper of the elder abuse allegations, he would ask for my apron before the lunch rush ended. I moved through the weeks with a forced mechanical cheerfulness. I wiped down the vinyl booths, scrubbed the stainless steel counters until they gleamed, and counted my meager tips at the end of every shift. I lived in a state of suspended animation. The 90-day countdown dictated my every waking thought. I could not plan for the future because my future hinged entirely on a caseworker flipping through a stack of financial ledgers in Augusta. I felt stripped of my autonomy, reduced to a case file number waiting for validation. But the passive waiting was not the most agonizing element of the bureaucratic trap. The state required comprehensive testimony to complete their evaluation. The investigator needed to interview the supposed victims of my financial crimes to build the official narrative. I knew Kevin would lie to protect his extortion scheme. I expected my brother to weave a tapestry of falsehoods to save his boat. What I did not expect was the profound, shattering betrayal that emerged from the formal interview transcripts. The true depth of the tragedy was not forged in a courtroom or a bait shed, but in the quiet, sworn testimony of the woman who raised me. The heaviest blows in a legal battle do not always arrive with the bang of a judge's gavel or the dramatic shouting of a courtroom cross-examination. Sometimes the most devastating strike is delivered through the mail, wrapped in a plain manila envelope, resting quietly inside a metal postal box. December arrived in coastal Maine with a bitter, bone-chilling frost. The tourist season was a distant memory, leaving the Route 1 diner populated almost entirely by locals wearing heavy wool and insulated boots. I spent my days moving through the motions of my job, serving hot chowder and pouring coffee, carrying the invisible weight of the state investigation on my shoulders. I checked my mailbox every afternoon, dreading the arrival of official correspondence. 3 weeks into the 90-day waiting period, I found a thick envelope bearing the return address of my attorney in Bangor. I climbed the wooden stairs to my apartment, my work shoes heavy on the frozen steps. I did not bother turning on the television or the radio. The silence of the cramped space above the hardware store felt appropriate. I sat on my worn fabric sofa, the springs groaning softly under my weight, and slid my thumb under the adhesive flap of the envelope. Inside, I found a brief clipped cover letter from my lawyer. He explained that Adult Protective Services had conducted their mandatory preliminary interviews with the alleged victims. Under state disclosure rules, the legal counsel for the accused is permitted to review the sworn statements to prepare a defense. He warned me to read the attached pages carefully and reminded me yet again to maintain a strict boundary of no contact. Beneath the cover letter lay a stark black and white document printed in a sterile courier font. It was the official interview transcript between the state caseworker and my mother, Martha. To understand what reading that transcript felt like, you have to understand who my mother is. Martha was a high school homecoming queen who married a handsome, hardworking fisherman. She built her entire identity around the concept of the pristine, successful Down East family. She curated our public image with meticulous care, ensuring we always wore our Sunday best to church and brought the finest baked goods to the municipal bake sales. As she aged, that fierce need for social validation transferred entirely to her role as a grandmother. Being seen at the ice rink cheering for Kevin's boys was not just a pastime, it was the core of her existence. I turned the page and began to read the questions posed by the state investigator. The caseworker asked Martha to describe the origins of the irrevocable Medicaid Asset Protection Trust created 3 years ago. I scanned the corresponding answer. The words printed on the page did not make sense at first. I had to read the paragraph 3 times before the reality of her statement settled into my brain. Martha lied. She did not merely stretch the truth or offer a confused interpretation of past events. She delivered a calculated, deliberate perjury to a state official under penalty of law. Martha testified that I had coerced them into signing the trust documents. She claimed that I had utilized my youth and my financial independence to intimidate them, threatening to abandon them to a subpar nursing facility if they did not put the ancestral farmhouse in my name. She painted a picture of a predatory daughter manipulating 2 frightened seniors into signing away their legacy. The investigator then asked about the current financial blockade. The caseworker inquired why I was refusing to sign the decanting waiver to release the $80,000 in home equity. Martha's recorded response felt like a sharp serrated knife sliding between my ribs. She testified that I was hoarding their money out of pure, unadulterated spite. My mother utilized the exact same cruel narrative that Kevin had weaponized at the dining table. She told the government official that because I was an aging spinster with no husband and no children of my own, I harbored a deep, toxic resentment toward my brother. She claimed I was holding the family funds hostage simply to punish Kevin for having the beautiful family I had failed to build. I lowered the pages to my lap. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded deafening in the quiet apartment. My chest tightened, constricting my lungs until drawing a breath became a conscious, difficult effort. The betrayal was staggering in its scope. Sarah's vicious text message had worked perfectly. By banning the grandparents from the Thanksgiving table and threatening to withhold the boys on Christmas morning, Sarah had forced my mother into a corner. Martha faced the prospect of a silent, empty farmhouse during the holidays. She could not endure the perceived social humiliation of losing her grandsons. To buy her ticket back into the hockey rinks and the holiday gatherings, she needed to deliver my signature to Kevin. Since I refused to surrender, she chose to sacrifice my freedom instead. By swearing to these lies, Martha was actively validating an elder exploitation charge. In the state of Maine, financial abuse of a senior citizen is a felony. It carries the very real threat of severe fines and prison time. My own mother was willing to let me face criminal prosecution, willing to let the state destroy my livelihood, just to appease the son who was actively bankrupting them. She traded my future for a front-row seat at a youth hockey game. American culture places a heavy, romanticized emphasis on the concept of maternal love. We are taught from childhood that a mother's devotion is fierce, protective, and entirely unconditional. We are told that a mother will stand between her child and any incoming threat. Sitting on my faded sofa, holding the notarized proof of my mother's perjury, that cultural myth shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Her love was highly conditional. It was contingent on my utility. As long as I was writing checks to pay the heating oil and property taxes, I was a good daughter. The moment I closed my checkbook and demanded respect, I became disposable collateral damage. A single tear spilled over my lower lash line, cutting a hot path down my cheek. Then another followed. I did not wail or scream as I had on the commercial docks. There was no chaotic energy left in my system. I just wept quietly, the tears soaking into the collar of my flannel shirt. I mourned the death of the family I thought I had. I cried for the years I had wasted pouring coffee and taping my shoes together to protect people who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient ATM. I sat there until the natural light outside my window faded into a deep, bruising purple. The hardware store below locked its doors for the night, the heavy metal latches echoing up through the floorboards. The quiet weeping eventually subsided, leaving behind a hollow, aching void in my chest. I picked up the transcript and carefully folded the heavy paper along its original creases. I slid the document back into the manila envelope and placed it on the coffee table. The profound grief slowly hardened into something else. The betrayal burned away the last lingering threads of familial guilt. I no longer questioned my sanity. I no longer wondered if I was being too harsh by refusing to sign the trust waiver. The gloves were officially off. They had brought the machinery of the state into my life, intending to crush me into submission. They assumed the threat of an elder abuse investigation would terrify me into signing the papers just to make the nightmare stop. What they failed to realize is that a person who has lost everything no longer operates out of fear. Kevin and Martha thought they had won by putting their lies on the official state record. They believed they had cornered me. I knew that Kevin, emboldened by my mother's sworn testimony and assuming the Adult Protective Services investigation, had me cowering in terror, would soon grow dangerously arrogant. Predators who think they have successfully trapped their prey rarely stay quiet. They want to gloat. They want to parade their victory and watch their victims squirm. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and stood up from the sofa. I prepared for my next shift, knowing my brother would not be able to resist bringing his newfound confidence directly into my only remaining safe space. The Route 1 diner on a Sunday morning operates like a well-oiled engine running at maximum capacity. By 7:00, the parking lot is overflowing with rusted pickup trucks and municipal snowplows. The air inside the restaurant hangs heavy with the rich, dense smells of frying bacon, spilled maple syrup, and dark roast coffee. The windows are perpetually fogged with condensation from the bitter coastal cold clashing against the radiant heat of the flat-top grill. It is a loud, chaotic environment filled with the clinking of heavy ceramic mugs and the low, steady rumble of local gossip. Machias is a town where everyone knows your business, and the diner serves as the central hub for exchanging that currency. I moved through the narrow aisles between the vinyl booths with practiced efficiency, balancing heavy oval plates piled high with scrambled eggs and fried haddock. The profound grief that had crushed me on my living room sofa days earlier was gone. The tears had dried up entirely, leaving behind a cold, hardened resolve. Reading my mother's sworn perjury had burned away the last remnants of my familial guilt. I no longer viewed myself as a victim trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. I was simply a woman waiting for the right moment to strike back. That moment arrived shortly after 8:00. The brass bell fastened above the front door chimed sharply, cutting through the din of the breakfast rush. A blast of freezing air swept into the entryway. I looked up from wiping down a stainless steel counter and watched my brother swagger into the restaurant. Kevin did not attempt to keep a low profile. He wanted an audience. Through the frosted front windows, I could see his brand new Ford diesel truck idling in the prime parking spot near the entrance. He wore a pristine, expensive, heavy canvas jacket over a thick fisherman's sweater. He carried himself with the arrogant, inflated posture of a man who believed he had just won a war. Emboldened by our mother's lies and assuming the state investigation had me cowering in terror, he decided to bring his victory parade directly into my only remaining safe space. He wanted to humiliate me in front of my boss and my regular customers. He wanted to watch me squirm. He bypassed the open stools at the counter and walked directly toward my assigned section. He slid into booth number 4, a prime location situated right in the middle of the busiest part of the dining room. To his left sat a table of local lumberjacks wearing high-visibility yellow hoodies. To his right sat a booth packed with veteran fishermen men who had hauled traps alongside our father decades ago. Kevin stretched his arms across the back of the red vinyl seat, flashing a smug, victorious grin in my direction. He was daring me to react. He wanted another dockside meltdown. He wanted me to scream and throw things so he could call the state investigator and report my erratic behavior. I did not give him the satisfaction. I did not drop my tray. My hands did not tremble. I walked over to the commercial coffee brewer, pulled a fresh pot of steaming dark roast off the burner, and retrieved a clean ceramic mug. I navigated the crowded aisle with a steady, measured pace. I approached his booth and placed the heavy white mug on the Formica table. I poured the dark liquid, filling the cup to the brim without spilling a single drop. Kevin leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. He offered a condescending chuckle, preparing to deliver a whispered insult about the pending government inquiry. He opened his mouth to speak. I cut him off before he could form a single syllable. I leaned forward, resting my free hand flat against the edge of his table. I did not raise my voice to a frantic scream. I did not weep. I utilized a clear conversational volume, pitching my words perfectly so they would cut through the ambient noise and reach the ears of the men sitting in the adjacent booth. I asked him how he planned to pay his outstanding invoices at the Harbor Cooperative. The smug grin on his face faltered, freezing into a mask of sudden confusion. I kept my tone casual, as if we were discussing the winter weather forecast. I noted that the primary bait suppliers down on the commercial docks were complaining loudly about his delinquent accounts. I mentioned by name the specific trap maker who had been calling his cell phone for 3 weeks, noting that the man was tired of Kevin dodging his calls. I asked if the bank was still threatening to seize his boat slip, or if he was just planning to hide his new diesel truck so the repo men could not find it. In a sprawling metropolis, airing a person's financial struggles might just be considered rude, but in a rugged Maine fishing community, it is a lethal, calculated strike. Down East Maine operates on a strict unspoken code of honor. In the commercial fishing industry, credit is rarely based on formal bank approvals or extensive paperwork. It is built entirely on reputation and a firm handshake. A captain is only as good as his word. If you buy your salted herring on credit, you pay the supplier the moment you sell your catch. If you cannot pay your debts, you face your creditors like a man and negotiate a timeline. Dodging phone calls and hiding from suppliers is the ultimate sin. It signals to the entire harbor that you are untrustworthy. Exposing a captain as a deadbeat ruins his standing faster than a sunken vessel. My clear projecting voice carried effortlessly across the aisle. The diner possesses a unique acoustic quality, and the sudden mention of unpaid cooperative bills acted like a magnet for the locals. The heavy clinking of silverware at the adjacent tables ceased. The group of veteran fishermen in booth 3 stopped chewing their toast. They turned their heads, their weathered faces etched with sudden intense scrutiny, staring directly at the golden sun of the local fleet. The lumberjacks to his left paused their conversation, casting heavy, judgmental glances toward his pristine canvas jacket. Kevin realized instantly that he was surrounded by his peers. The men who dictated the social hierarchy of the harbor were listening to every word I said. The transition in my brother was immediate and staggering to witness. The arrogant, untouchable posture collapsed. The smug superiority vanished from his eyes, replaced by a raw, sheer panic. He shrank back into the vinyl booth, pulling his arms inward as if trying to make himself smaller. A deep, furious crimson flush crept up his neck, spreading rapidly across his cheeks and forehead. His carefully curated image of a highly successful, prosperous lobsterman fractured into a million irreparable pieces under the harsh fluorescent lights. He opened his mouth to deny the accusations, to call me a liar. But he looked at the hardened faces of the fishermen staring at him. He knew they would check the harbor ledger. He knew the bait suppliers would confirm my story by the end of the day. Any defense he offered now would only dig his grave deeper. Kevin grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He scrambled to slide out of the booth, his heavy boots catching awkwardly on the metal table leg. He stood up, his face burning red with unmitigated humiliation. He did not look at me. He did not look at the men watching him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $1 bill, and threw it onto the formica surface to pay for the coffee he had not even touched. He turned and practically ran toward the exit. He shoved the glass door open, the brass bell chiming a frantic, chaotic rhythm in his wake. He jogged through the freezing parking lot, climbed into his expensive truck, and sped away, his tires spinning uselessly on the icy asphalt before catching traction. I stood by the empty booth holding the glass coffee pot. I picked up the crumpled dollar bill, slid it into my apron pocket, and wiped the table clean with a damp rag. The veteran fishermen in the next booth offered me a quiet, respectful nod before returning to their breakfasts. The confrontation provided a sharp, satisfying rush of vindication. I had exposed his charade to the exact audience he desperately wanted to impress. But as I walked back to the kitchen, the adrenaline faded, replaced by the cold reality of my situation. Humiliating Kevin in a diner did not erase the formal inquiry filed in Augusta. It did not cancel the impending financial audit or undo my mother's perjury. Emotional victories offer temporary comfort, but they do not hold up in a court of law.